I sat in the back of the room and heard a lot of questions and understand the subject matter expertise in the room, so that's good. And I think there could be times where the questions get beyond my depth. I'm a policy guy and a politician, and here's how I come by this conversation. And some of you are from Colorado. I see Alan Best, who sort of saw my time as governor and then since then at Colorado State University. I actually had been a prosecutor as the district attorney of Denver before I was a candidate for governor, had not paid much attention to issues around either climate or clean energy. When I decided to run for governor, I had a couple years really to study the issues and just went to school on what I thought were the biggest issues in Colorado and landed upon these two issues, the issue around clean energy as an opportunity, but also around climate change and other environmental concerns as a threat. And we kind of married those two things in what we called at the time the new energy economy, which was really about trying to develop energy resources domestically, do them in a way that provided economic development, but also really address environmental concerns. If you've noticed so far, there are 3 E's: energy, economic development, and environment, and we added a fourth to that, which was equity, to try and do that in a way that really made a difference to the people who were sort of at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the people who were either impoverished or lower middle income people, to try and design an energy system that took into account affordability, because it's really important for policymakers. And as Sunshine said in the introduction, I wound up signing about 57 different clean energy bills over a 4-year period, left office after a term and went to Colorado State University, where I run this Center for the New Energy Economy. And the thesis at the time, it was 2011, the thesis at the time is that Congress seemed stalemated around big, comprehensive policy making on energy or environment, and that states is where the action was. After about a year of being at the center, I was asked by the White House to convene subject matter experts from around the country and do a report for the President of the United States about what the federal government could do with the President's executive authority in moving an energy agenda, and really a clean energy agenda, if Congress, in fact, was stalemated. So you don't have to be a Mensa scholar to understand the thesis is a pretty good thesis, right? Congress is stalemated. I've testified a couple of times in front of the Senate Committee for Public Works and Environment, both when Barbara Boxer was the chair and I was governor, and then after that, when James Inhofe became the chair. And it's a pretty, there's not much happening in those committees, right? If you've read the book by the person from Brookings, person from American Enterprise Institute, they've written a book together called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and it's about the United States Congress. And after being in front of that committee, I want to write the sequel, It's Even Worse Than It's Even Worse Than It Looks, because it really is quite awful. And so in kind of understanding that we have really a great deal of stalemating and what you'd call Congress being at loggerheads. In fact, most of what's happened is, as the Republicans have been sort of, opposing what would be President Obama's climate and energy agenda, and the president trying to move this, and this question about how much presidential authority can you exercise to move that kind of agenda without the legitimacy from congressional action. And it's a real question on the minds of a lot of people. And I think if you're going to look at the stay of the Clean Power Plan, which was stayed by the United States Supreme Court in a stunningly unusual move, it had everything to do with the Supreme Court acknowledging there is this real question at the federal level about that. So we wrote a report. It was called Powering Forward. It looked at energy efficiency, renewable energy, alternative fuels for vehicles, natural gas rulemaking, how the federal government should be involved in natural gas rulemaking development. And then it looked at business models for utilities for the 21st century. And what's the federal role in trying to look at the transitioning of those business models? Had 200 recommendations. You'll all say that's like ungodly. Who puts 200 recommendations? It was at the request of the White House that we put the 200 recommendations in. I would have never done that except that they asked for it. And so you ought to take a look at it, because there's a lot that the Obama administration has done, a lot that the an incoming administration could do using what we believe to be the legitimate powers of the federal government and legislation that's already put in place the authority to do these things. Even if the legislation is in place, there's still the question, right, about whether you go beyond the legislative authority, and that's really the question on the table that's going to be argued in the D.C. Circuit next week about whether or not they've gone beyond what is possible for under the Clean Air Act in devising the Clean Power Plan. So I go to Colorado State University, and the hope was to work with states with this big project for the White House. But since then, most of our work has been concerned with state government. And I want to bring up a website that we have. There's a question about, kind of what databases are out there. And whoever said there's overload, I completely agree. But one of the ways we overload this is by two different databases. I'm going to show you this one. If we can bring it up, I'll describe the other one first before this. So we actually began paying attention to this and then put a database together that looks at every piece of energy legislation introduced at the state level. And it's called the Advanced Energy Legislation Tracker. And talk about overload. There are 4,000 pieces in the first year we do this of energy legislation. Only 600 out of the 4,000 actually became law. That's called www.aeltracker.org. So we track every piece of legislation, and you can actually see it as it goes from one place to another. The one I want to focus on now is one we just published in concert with the Nature Conservancy. And because this session is going to be in part about policy that's out there, we looked at what was happening at the federal level and with executive agencies, what was not happening with respect to congressional action, and then looked at what was happening at states and said, listen, states are really where the action is in terms of clean energy policies. So we devised, my center did, these 38 different clean energy policies that were about market preparation, market creation, or market expansion, and then we looked at each state. So somebody name a state. The state of Washington, go into the state of Washington, and clicks on the state of Washington, and it's a snapshot. And what happens is we give you a little bit of, I gotta figure out how, yeah. So we give you a little bit to do with just kind of what's going on. That big blue area, that circle area over there, that's hydroelectric energy. It tells you about the percentage of power and what it's generated from. So you can see that it's partly, natural gas is probably the next biggest one. Nuclear is 8.2%. Petroleum is very tiny. Coal is 5.8%. This varies from state to state to state, but you can see all that hydro in there as a part of there. And then we say, okay, in the 38 different things that we consider kind of the state clean energy policies, what's a state done? And we ask 4 or 5 questions about each policy in each state. So interconnection is, in terms of market preparation, interconnection and net metering sort of go hand in hand. And there's some things that you do that are policy stacking as well. A lot of people say, well, we have net energy metering, but we didn't really produce good interconnection standards, which means that you didn't do all you could do. So we asked 5 questions about interconnection in the state of Washington. Has 4 shades of blue, meaning they've done just about all. There was a discussion earlier today about decoupling. You look at decoupling here, it means the state of Washington has done just about all they can do from the perspective of what other states have done in the area of decoupling. Go down to new utility business model proceedings. There are no shades of blue, meaning the state of Washington really has not yet looked at what's happening with respect to changing business models for the 21st century. So that first set is the market preparation. The next column is market creation. So you see renewable portfolio standards. A state like California with Senate Bill 350 is going to have 5 shades of blue. They're the head of the pack along with states like New York, Vermont, Hawaii, and Oregon that went to 50% renewable energy standards. They're going to have 5 shades of blue, and there will be states with no RPS, like the state of Wyoming, and it will have no shades of blue in terms of a renewable portfolio standard. But there's a lot of other things in that column beyond just RPSs that are about preparing the market. So you can see smart meter deployment, a grid modernization plan. At the very bottom of this is emission standards. If you paid attention to sort of state policy, this big argument over renewable portfolio standards, it became very politicized, particularly after the 2010 elections. And there's this group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, very conservative in its orientation. They really was pushing back about RPSs and went into a variety of states with legislation to try and undermine the RPSs. They weren't all that successful, quite frankly. They were successful in Indiana. They were successful to get a moratorium passed in Ohio. But after that, the moratorium is set to be debated again and voted on again, and it's likely to come off. In the other states that had RPSs, ALEC wasn't very successful, but there's a real, energy, pardon the pun, to talk about emission standards, and it's more of a bipartisan focus. And the renewable portfolio standards sort of pick, it seems, technologies by what is renewable and what's not. In Colorado, quite frankly, we had a 10% RPS that was passed at the ballot, and then I signed a bill that went to 20 and signed another bill that went to 30, but we chose what technologies were in and out of that, and we've done some modifying, some amending of that, but we didn't include hydro, in part because the environmental community convinced us both at the beginning when we passed it on the ballot, when I made it a 20% and then a 30%, that if you did hydro, the big utilities were likely to do a lot of hydro because they knew how to do that. And they understood hydro. It was a big part of the portfolio already, but there are a lot of environmental concerns in doing hydro, particularly in the Intermountain West, where the areas where you're likely to do that are fairly pristine. And Alan will remember probably the Two Forks debate, which was about a big area that we're just going to fill in. And it was a debate that went on for years and years and quite frankly wound up never happening because of the pushback against it. We have a northern Colorado project that has been sort of in the offing for a very long time, including all of the permitting that's gone through, and it's still not, there's still no power being drawn through it. There's no water being stored there. It's because water is such a difficult thing to sort of debate. So you take something like wind and think about private land and understand in Colorado, most of the really good wind resources are on the eastern plains, whereas there's very little federal land, and most of it is, in fact, private land. We went in a 10-year period from 275 megawatts of wind to now over 3,000, on our way toward 4,000 megawatts of wind. Our biggest investor-owned utility is Xcel Energy, and they would say their best long-term bet right now in Colorado is wind. The deals are at about 3 cents a megawatt hour, and we did a lot by putting in place an RPS to require the utility to sort of get there and go in that direction. They are now filing resource plans with wind in the plan regardless of the RPS, just because it's both economic and because the wind resource in Colorado is fairly good. There are days in Colorado during the winter when about 60% of all of the energy that Xcel provides to its customers, and has 2/3 of all the customers in Colorado, or at least 2/3 of the load, about 60% of that is in fact wind resources. We mapped out, and I wish I had this graph here, but we mapped out a graph that showed who the biggest wind users are in the world, and we took the countries and the amount of wind they were using, and then we inserted in that states. And so the second biggest in terms of percentage of all of its load and wind, the second biggest after, I think, Denmark is South Dakota. And so we have a sprinkling of these states. South Dakota, Iowa have tremendous amounts of wind resources that's providing that load and providing it at a very low cost. Now, Texas, for example, has a renewable portfolio standard goal, but not an actual standard that operates as a mandate, and yet it has the most wind resources of any state in the country. There are now, I think, at 14 gigawatts. Their deals are below 3 cents a kilowatt hour, so there's a variety of places where it's not just policy. But I want to, before I sit down, talk a little bit about some of the things that we see in policy, both at the state and the federal level. The first of those things is the Clean Power Plan. My center, after the Clean Power Plan, the proposal was announced in 2014. It was June the 2nd of 2014. I met with the Western governors and suggested to the Western governors that I think somebody this morning said the Clean Power Plan in the West was a mess. I didn't say that it was a mess. I just said, I think we need regional convening here in the West. We knew that Duke University was pulling together southeastern states in the United States and some sort of mid-southern states, that the Great Plains Institute out of Minneapolis was working with a group of Midwestern states. Georgetown Law and Climate Center was working actually with the Reggie states and with some other mix of states beyond just Reggie, but nobody was really thinking about the West as a region, and could there be Clean Power Plan compliance? And so we wound up getting the agreement of 13 states. So think North Dakota, South Dakota, and every state west of that, the Intermountain West, and then the Pacific Northwest and California. And we began convening those states to really talk about the Clean Power Plan. And you can imagine the differences, right? You have California on one end of the spectrum, Wyoming on the other end of the spectrum. Wyoming's a state where the population's right around 500,000, and where it is the largest coal-producing state in the country. It's also, exporting a great deal of coal-fired generation. So you have states sort of like that. And I think there was a mention of somebody from Montana, that we have Montana there as well, which isn't all that unlike Wyoming in terms of the economies inside the state that are very reliant on a couple of things, both coal production, but coal-fired generation and exporting coal-fired generation is part of their economy. So we have those states convening with the likes of California, Oregon, and Washington and talking about Clean Power Plan compliance. The Supreme Court stayed the Clean Power Plan on February the 9th of this past year. It was a 5-4 decision. I think it was pretty unfortunate that happened, in part because we were having very constructive conversations about ways that we might ultimately comply with the Clean Power Plan as a region. Now, maybe not all states would have been, on board that, but we had a very, as I say, constructive conversation happening. And to the extent the Clean Power Plan survives the litigation, we hope to be able to pick up the baton on that and continue those kinds of conversations. The Clean Power Plan has a 32% reduction in emissions by 2030, and certainly in the West, we have a lot to be concerned with. The other thing that's really interesting about the West is the amount of federal land. So if I asked you right now what the percentage of federal land was in the state of Nevada, does anybody know? Who said? 87. I think it's 85. It's over 85, but so you're probably right there. In Colorado, it's 44. Wyoming, I think it's 44, 45. Idaho, it's 66%. The percentage of land, in the western states that we're convening that's federal land compared to the rest of the country is really significant. And if you think about how public lands can be part of both generating fossil fuels or the extraction of fossil fuels, gas, oil, coal, but also part of capturing solar resources, capturing wind resources, and then finally siting of transmission, then it's a really important part of us as a country figuring out how we take down our emissions and what happens to state economies or local economies in the process. So the Clean Power Plan, from my perspective, was this really important policy play by the Obama administration, and there was a lot about that was happening where I wish it wasn't stayed, because I think it was really doable in the end of the day. Quite frankly, there are a lot of people as well that would say the Clean Power Plan was not a climate plan. Like, if we really need to be on par or on course to hit the targets that we declared in Paris, the Clean Power Plan gets us partway there, but they certainly don't get us all the way there. They may not even get us all the way where we need to be by the 2030 deadline. So it was really important that we have that momentum, but that we understand there was still more that would need to be done. That's my second point, which is there is more happening in the states. And actually, while the Clean Power Plan is this important sort of driver, we see states doing a variety of very important things where they may get beyond what would have been their Clean Power Plan targets and give us the ability to really understand how we hit those targets through what we call subnationals, state and local government. So I don't know if you looked at it, but earlier this year there was 17 states, that signed off on sort of this clean energy coalition by states. What, in my mind, may have been most important about that was that 4 of those 17 governors were Republicans. So the governors of Massachusetts, Michigan, Iowa, and Nevada all were part of signing off on that. And why do I think that's so important? Because so much of what I consider to be the barriers at us being able to do what we need to in this clean energy transition have been political. and issues heavily politicized, and sometimes fairly politicized, but to the extent where conversation or debate shuts down in the United States Congress is maybe one of the best examples. There was a bill there, it was an energy efficiency bill called Shaheen-Portman. It had bipartisan support, it actually had majority support, and it never got out of the United States Senate, in part because of the kind of riders that would have been placed upon it had it come to, a full vote. In the Senate, there were all sorts of amendments that would have been placed on it, and all of these other kinds of issues, like the Keystone XL pipeline, find its way to being an amendment rider, and the Senate just shuts down. So to be able to have this conversation about energy and about clean energy, connect it back to environmental issues, including climate change, and take the politics out of it is really important. And we see that happening at the state level, and I would say, quite frankly, though it's not my subject matter expertise, also at the municipal level. So take a state like Texas, where it's hard, even in the state capital, to have a conversation sort of about clean energy and clean energy resources. They have these 14 gigawatts of wind. They have a tremendous solar resource, but they also have a couple of cities in that state, two of the biggest cities, San Antonio and Austin. So I think Austin's the fourth biggest city. Houston and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex are bigger than even San Antonio. But they have these climate goals and clean energy goals that are really in part driving things that are happening in that state apart from state policy. And we see that happening with municipalities around the country, where the work in municipalities and the work at the state level, the subnationals, are really driving this clean energy, what I would call energy revolution, to a place where, despite what the federal government's doing, and there are things the federal government could do that would make the situation far better, including, I believe, pricing carbon, but when that's not happening, there are still some things to look to, and that's particularly at the state and local level. So this coalition, this bipartisan coalition that includes Republican governors, was really hopeful to me. And then just finally, in my own sort of work with states, my own conversations with governors, I just have this sense that this is less politicized at the state level, that we think there are a lot of ways to describe this in terms of economic opportunity. And one of the things states like to do is to really think about economic opportunity as a competition. So every governor, I promise you, every governor in their State of the State message at the beginning of 2016 mentioned the economy of their state and mentioned what they were going to do to create jobs, to grow the economy. And to the extent you have some positive things to point to where clean tech and clean energy is concerned, that's helpful in having this conversation about something other than energy tied to climate change or energy tied to environmental concerns. So I believe, for my part, that it is less politicized at the governor's level, less politicized even than that at the municipal level, and those are opportunities for us to keep a clean energy agenda sort of at the forefront of our policy work, even while Congress seems to be stalemated. So with that, I'll conclude.